Sawadee-ka! Konnichiwa! Good afternoon. My name is 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, and I am the Project Manager of REDCON Asia, or Resilience on Emergency and Disaster Conference Asia. On behalf of VNU Asia Pacific, I would like to warmly welcome you to REDCON Asia's second webinar series entitled Partnership for Framework 2030, Creating an Enabling Environment to Support Developing Countries. How can we accelerate private sector engagement or increase public-private partnerships to boost the disaster resilience of developing countries? How can development countries or development partners be further incentivized to support developing countries so that they can implement the Sendai Framework? These are just some of the questions that will be addressed in the webinar. REDCON Asia is a multi-stakeholder conference and exhibition that envisions to engage the governments, the private sector, academia, nonprofits, intergovernmental organization, and financing institution, among others, in the value chain of disaster and emergency management, from problems to solutions that goes beyond risk reduction towards resilience. It will be held on 7th to 9th of December 2022 with the pre-launching edition on the 26th of July next year at the United Nations Conference Center in Bangkok. We are pleased to have the support of the Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation, or DDPM, under the Ministry of Interior Thailand, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, or ADPC, King Mongkut's University of Technology Thonburi School of Architecture and Design, GVF, and Mekong Institute as among our official supporting organizations. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the moderator for today, Ms. Barbara Jane Ewalls, the Executive Director of Initiative for Global Resilience, or I4GR. Ms. Barbara, take it away, please.
Thank you, Monica, for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I hope you're well and keeping safe. May I encourage everybody to say hello to us and tell us where you are from in the chat box. So just a few housekeeping rules before we start. Please type your questions at the Q&A icon and not in the chat, as I will be monitoring the questions at the Q&A window only. And also, please state the name of the speaker you wish to address your question to. And also, at the end of the webinar, there will be a survey. So please do take the time to answer the questions. That is very helpful for us. And with this, we also are going to run some polling questions, just very short ones, just to see where our participants are coming up. So please, Ops, if you could put in the polling questions. Okay. So the first poll is, from which region are you joining us? So either Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, West Asia, Middle East, or outside of Asia. Please answer your poll now. So here we are. The answer to our poll, 71% are from Southeast Asia, 11% are from South Asia, 9% from East Asia, 3% from West Asia, and 6% from outside of Asia. Thank you very much, and welcome to the webinar for the REDCON webinar. Now, could we please put the second poll question? The second one would be to see from which sector you come from. Are you from the government sector or intergovernmental organization, private sector, NGO, academia, financing institutes, international agency, or others? Please answer now. Okay, so the result of our polling, the second poll question is 26% are from the government sector, 21% intergovernmental organizations, 12% from private sector, tied with NGO at 12% and academia at 12% too. International agency at 15% and others 3%. Great. Thank you so much for answering. And now, finally, we have our last poll question. So, which superpower would you like to have? Would you like to be a mind reader? Would you like to be invisible? Would you like to have teleportation powers? Or would you like to fly? Or I already have a superpower. Please answer. So the winning superpower is mind reading. Really? I wouldn't want to read other people's minds. Invisibility, 24%. Oh no, teleportation is number one at 34%. Flying at 5%. Whoa, I already have a superpower at 16%. Actually, that was also what I answered, but my superpower is binging Netflix. So don't know if that's really a superpower. Anyway, with that, we end our polling questions. Thank you so much for everyone for joining the polling. And right now, I will just want to give you a quick overview of what is going to be discussed and introduce our speakers. So are you able to see my PowerPoint? Is this okay? Okay, so welcome everyone again, and thank you for joining us here at the REDCON webinar. This webinar is actually in celebration of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. So what is IDRR in October 13? This was a day designated by the UN General Assembly to promote and imbibe a culture of DRR. But not only that, but also to show how far the world has progressed since the establishment of the Sendai Framework in 2015. The goal for this year is actually to provide a platform to show best practice in terms of international cooperation, what worked and what did not since the establishment of the framework. So as you know, today is Target F is being celebrated today. Hashtag DRR Day was started in 2016 to highlight the 7 targets of the Sendai Framework. As you see, the first 4 targets was aimed at reduction, and the remaining 3 was to increase or enhance. Target F, as you see, is enhance international cooperation for developing countries. Now, the key word here is cooperation plus developing countries. And this is why. The year 2021 promises to be a make or break year when it comes to delivering on the policy agenda agreed in 2015. Without real action on climate change in the next 10 years, extreme weather events will be overwhelming, especially for developing countries. And as we all know, LMICs are disproportionately affected. And while the Sendai Framework has been able to get member states to develop strategies, it's a different story when it comes to implementation. LMICs need more support, not only in terms of financing, but also in policy formation and clobbering together international agreements, as disaster knows no bounds. So according to the WMO, only half of the members have multi-hazard early warning systems in place. And there are severe gaps in places like Africa, Latin America, and SIDS, or the small island developing states. This is actually quite worrying, and this is what actually one of the issues that are being highlighted for hashtag DRR Day. Even before the pandemic, the disasters were already costing the world $520 million annually, with 26 million pushed into poverty every year, according to the World Bank. And the struggle of many developing countries to manage COVID-19 pandemic highlights how vulnerable these states are. 2.3 billion people are food insecure in 2020. And whatever gains in poverty alleviation the world has achieved, it was wiped out by this pandemic. This is why the international community must increase cooperation to support climate-affected countries in setting sustainable adaptation priorities and build resilience and reduce risk. As with Goal 17 of the SDGs, Target F shows us how important partnerships are in moving forward with our collective goal and reducing risk and building resilience. Our speakers will be showcasing cooperation success and best practice in order to learn and hopefully adapt into our own networks. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Kozo Nagami. He is the Deputy Director General for Global Environment Department, Disaster Risk Reduction, and Group Director at the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA. Dr. Kozo is currently leading the materialization of JICA's Global Agenda for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, a new DRR strategy for JICA's development cooperation. Prior to his current role, he engaged in JICA's operation in multiple countries in the context of post-disaster recovery, including in Indonesia, 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, Sendai after the 2011 Great East Japan earthquakes, and Nepal, the 2015 Nepal Gorkha earthquake. Dr. Nagami, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you so much for your kind introduction. My name is again Kozo Nagami, and it's a very much great honor to have this today's opportunity to share the ideas and the strategy of JICA disaster risk reduction sector. Let me go first for the how. What is JICA? Many of you, I guess, very much familiar with JICA as an organization, I hope. But for those who are not familiar, this is just a brief overview.
Hi, Dr. Nagami. Would you mind if you could speak a bit louder because we cannot hear you? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Good?
Much better now.
Okay. Sorry. This is the overview of JICA. And as you can see at the right-hand side, there is a column of the budget size of our annual operation here. We have three kinds of modality for our assistance or cooperation. One thing is technical cooperation. That is, work together with the developing countries for their sustainable development. And we are spending at 175 billion yen. And the other thing is a line of credit, ODA loan, 1.5 trillion yen. And the other is grants, 85 billion yen. And talking about the DRR, as many of you already aware, Japan is very much prone to natural hazards and disasters caused by the hazards. And as you can see in the pictures, historically, as our nation and our ancestors and citizens are living together with natural hazards and returning back to their normal day-to-day operation from the disasters in the course of recovery. So we are repeating that cycle again and again in the thousands of years. And this is a kind of review of what the disaster risk is. And we have three elements in particular: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. These are the elements of the disaster risk, as all of us know. But we have to be sure there is a certain sequence among those three elements. It always starts from hazard, and our human society exposed to the hazard. And our human society yield damages and losses caused by hazard due to the vulnerability, right? So these are the kind of sequence among those three elements. So we have to remind ourselves, disaster is multi-stage, certain sequence among risk factors. That is one thing. And the other thing is disaster is multi-dimension, multi-sectoral elements. And we can divide it into two typology. One thing is extrinsic risk factors, and the other thing is intrinsic risk factors. And the left-hand side is extrinsic hazard and exposure. That is our main target of DRR interventions by JICA. And as you could see in the former slides, the chain of disaster always starts from hazard and exposure. So our main focus is how we can mitigate or control the impacts to our human society by the hazard and exposure. But eventually, the disaster occurs due to the vulnerability of our human society. But our vulnerability has a multi-dimension, multi-sectoral characteristics. physical vulnerability, economic vulnerability, social vulnerability, and environmental vulnerability, and cultural vulnerability, and institutional governance vulnerability. All of them are the eventual effect by the natural hazard is determined by the vulnerability of our human society itself. But for the DRR folks like us, we have to maintain our concentration in the left-hand side. The right-hand side, vulnerability aspect, should be worked together by all the stakeholders, not only by the DRR people, right? So we have to work together, getting out of silo, together with the health sector, education sector, economic development sector, and everything should be in collective actions to minimize our human society's vulnerability. That is the right-hand side, intrinsic aspect. And we are focusing on 3 clusters as strategies, as you can see in the red letters. Cluster 1, pre-disaster investment for capital concentration centers. And cluster 2, DRR institutions establishment for better understanding of disaster risk and risk governance. And number 3, securing Build Back Better. So number 1 and number 2 is for the ex-ante situation before the natural hazard or disaster happens. And we have to do the pre-disaster investment efforts so that we can minimize the actual damage and losses caused by natural hazards. But we cannot fully avoid the impact of all disasters, damage and losses. So we have to, at the same time, secure the Build Back Better after the disaster. And our 3 strategies, 3 clusters, are closely related with, of course, with the SFDRR, Sendai Framework, and also with the SDGs, in particular, these 4 goals. And to pursue our strategy in DRR, we have to wisely choose what to do for the countermeasures to pre-disaster investment, considering the type of hazard. The upper part is a high controllable type of hazard, like flood, landslide, storm surge. For those type of hazard, we have to apply DRR infrastructure enhancement, like retarding basin, constructing dam for flood, and widening the river channel, etc., etc. And for the other type, low controllable type of hazard, like earthquake, volcanic eruption, we have to focus ourselves to enhance the critical infrastructure resilience, such as transportation, electricity, water supply, telecommunication, school, and the hospitals, because these hazards cannot be controlled by humankind or human wisdom or human investment, right? We have to respectively strengthen our exposed part of assets, infrastructure, and buildings to mitigate the shock from the hazards. So we have to wisely, systematically separate based on the type of hazard. And how we can approach to the ultimate goal to minimize the disaster risk. We always put in our mind this kind of S-curve to the ultimate goal, to the end. And S-curve goal is reaching to the threshold border in between extensive hazard risk and intensive hazard risk. But this borderline should be determined by the respective country and government, right? In Japan, we set this threshold border level, for example, for flood, once 100 for the flood return period. So, but we are still on the way to reach to the ultimate goal. And the goal is moving ahead due to the urbanization, further accumulation of asset, and climate risk. So we are still in the middle of the S-curve process. And many of the countries are still in the, almost all of the countries are still in the way to reach to the ultimate goal. But our cluster one is focusing somehow how we can reach to the summit of this mountain. This is number one, cluster one, structure with structural DR measures. So although the summit of the mountain is very high, like Mount Fuji, and we are the snail climbing up the mountain, but we should never stop moving ahead. If we stop here, the future cannot be changed anymore, and the climate risk is increasing. So we have to move ahead. That is cluster one. But in reality, in front of us, there is a residual extensive risk. So we have to mobilize not only the structural measures, but also the non-structural measures, mobilizing everything we have as a human society collectively. And this reaching to the ultimate goal of extensive risk is the main responsibility should be borne by the state government. And the residual risk part is NGO, CSO, and the citizens itself, and the private sector's responsibility. We have to share the responsibility effectively and systematically. And that is cluster number two. And for the
Dr. Nagami, my apologies. You're running out of time. Could you do your closing? Sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So this is the Sendai initiative, and we have achieved the goal, as you can see, and now we are achieving the initiative phase 2. And this is the example of Mangahan floodway of Manila metropolitan area. So we cooperate with the Philippine government, and the Philippine government successfully constructed this floodway, and they increased this amount of DRR investment, and they could attain this kind of, remarkable effect of structural measures. As you can see, the right-hand side map is indicating the actual damage caused by the Ulysses typhoon last year. But if without such a accumulation of structural measures, they were exposed to this huge damage. So this remarkable example is showing you the importance of structural measures. This is a Bangladesh seismic retrofitting example. And this is the last slide. We are now facing the climate change risk, and at least double with 1.5 degree increasing scenario. And we have to mobilize our knowledge. And this is not the developing country and the developed country issue. We have to combine our wisdom for the bright future together. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you so much. Sorry for the overtime.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagami. Thank you as well for reiterating the fact that DRR is not a rich north problem or poor problem or poor country south poor problem. It's everybody's problem. And good to know about your projects in the Philippines and in Bangladesh. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Mr. 𝗙𝗏𝗺𝗏𝗁. He's the Deputy Executive Director of the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, or ADPC. Mr. 𝗙𝗏𝗺 has been involved in various activities in APEC and has served as an expert and resource person for the SME Disaster Resilience, Business Continuity Planning, and SME Digital Resilience, O2O projects. Among other notable initiatives, he mentors the ADPC's private sector 𝗖𝗄𝗵𝗺 Facility and Post-Disaster Needs Assessment Initiative Ready for Recovery. Dr. Aslam, Mr. Aslam, right?
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Can I just share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. Just give me 1 second. Why is it not showing? Can you see the screen now?
It's blank on my side.
Okay. Just 1 second. Apologies. Is it?
This. Now it's great.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And thank you very much, REDCON, Monica, and all the colleagues for providing this opportunity to me. I will just touch base today on the topic of financing resilient development and in the context of Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. But I certainly will start with a slight different connotation. So let me just first read out what recently I read in one of the Twitter message. What it says is that the infrastructure that we will have by 2050, half of them is not yet built. If we get this right, in the next 5 to 10 years, we are locking in resilience. If we don't get it right, we are locking in risk. With this, I think I will focus today how best we together as partners and stakeholders and beneficiaries can locking in resilience. I also give you an opportunity to look at if we do not get it right, how we can get locked in risk. 2050, I just put it because I know that most of us in disaster risk reduction talking about the different global framework, which is ending by 2030. The COVID-19 certainly has put a huge challenge for us, whether or not we would be able to achieve all those targets. But those targets we collectively endorse, we collectively imbibed in our programs. Let me now go to 2050. Perhaps I will be celebrating my 80th birthday in 2050 among the projected 9.2 billion people in the world. I hope some of you would celebrate the 100th birthday. But what I really want to highlight here that we are in a very, very extraordinary time where a number of things particularly will be determined by the sheer demand of the human kind. Infrastructure is one of that would be needed, the basic facilities that would be required. And with the ever increasing population, we know that how exposure would create more and more vulnerability. So, if we have to locking in resilience, my first point would be to envisage risk scenarios, not only for 2030, but beyond. To do this, we must invest more in the development of composite risk metrics to identify and stratify vulnerable population and their varying needs and capacities. Our colleague from JICA already highlighted that in which circumstances we are living with climate change disturbing the entire natural hazard and risk driver. We must be very, very careful in utilizing science to have better risk assessment and targeted actions. COVID-19 actually has exposed a number of fault lines and fragilities in our risk governance system. That is why I'm presenting the second point on locking in resilience by highlighting that we must localize resilience. What we saw since early 2020 that most of our disaster risk reduction policies, plan, strategies, framework really did not do well to predict, to treat, to respond the way we faced the pandemic, thanks to the health workers, thanks to the many other scientists. But we also realize that if we really have to think about future, we really have to think very carefully that it is not only the risk awareness that matters. We must translate risk-informed investment and decision. More importantly, the systematic integration of resilience at the initial stages of development planning must be supported by appropriate financing. And that is why my third point is we must finance development, those who, both from a public and a private spending, but for a resilient development concept. What it means is that we must take account the climate and disaster risk by utilizing the technologies that is available to us and the lessons that we have already learned during the COVID time, that we really can generate a number of innovative technologies to mitigate and respond to a pandemic. Let's use the same technology to enhance our resilience. Let's invest more and more on space technologies. Let's invest more and more on internet-based technologies so that we can predict it ahead of time. I'm just highlighting this because very recently on the 30th of September and the 1st of October, ADPC's Regional Consultative Committee held its annual meeting in Korea. Of course, it was online, and we adopted a Sejong statement by highlighting financing resilient development. My last one, and as you see that every time I'm talking about my options for locking in resilience on the right-hand side of my presentation, I'm also highlighting that these are not an individual attributes. These are generally the priorities of the Sendai Framework for Risk Reduction. The four important one for locking in resilience is about future financing needs. As you know, that disaster will occur. So is the post-disaster, post-pandemic, post-climate extreme events where recovery, reconstruction would be needed. We must achieve resilience through stronger, faster, and inclusive disaster resilient infrastructure. Stronger by having technologies, by pre-arranged mechanism, faster by making sure that people who are displaced can be back on their business as quickly as possible. By inclusive means we must be equity and right-based in terms of whenever we decide our future infrastructure pattern. With this, I just give you a chance to look at, if we do not locking in resilience, we certainly are locking in the risk. And the cost of doing less is riskier. I'm just highlighting this part of the slide from a perspective of the Arup's study on 4 plausible futures. They have actually predicted based on the SDGs and also the science-based targets of planetary boundaries. What it actually says from human health and planetary health, that if we do not invest in resilient development, we certainly can see the extensive degradation of both planetary and human conditions. And that certainly would further increase disaster risk in globally as well as in Asia Pacific. With this, I just would like to congratulate here, particularly to REDCON, because between locking in resilience and locking in risk, what lies is the partnership. And for this partnership, and among many, I again would highlight Asian Disaster Preparedness Center's Regional Consultative Committee. For the last 1 decade, 11 years actually, since 2000, when not much partnership for disaster risk reduction was formulated, we have been there calling all the time to invest in preparedness. Our meeting in September and in October, we again called for countries, for stakeholders, for multilateral banking, for unlocking the investment by public and private in resilient development. With this, I end here. Thank you very much, and we'll be ready for questions at the later stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aslam, for a great presentation and reminding us of the 4 priorities for locking in resilience and how extensive the degradation would be if we do not start investing in for the future right now. Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Ernst. He's the Senior DRR Hydrometeorological Hazards Advisor from the Office of the Technical Program Quality of USAID Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. So Dr. Ernst has supported USAID's humanitarian assistance and related DRR efforts for the Nepal earthquake, floods and landslides in Uttarakhand, and Cyclone Pailin in Odisha, India. Michael also has extensive experience working with the UNDP, or the United Nations Development Program, and other UN system agencies on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues across Asia. Dr. Ernst, your turn.
Okay, thank you, and welcome everyone. I will very quickly turn off my video because I'm a little concerned about bandwidth and have the presentation presented by the conference organizers. So the first slide, please. Okay. Okay, you can start the presentation. Very good. Okay, so hello again. My name is Michael Ernst, and I'm a Senior Disaster Risk Reduction Advisor in USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. I'm delighted to be able to interact with you today as part of this important panel discussion in support of partnerships for disaster risk reduction as part of the Sendai Framework's goals for 2030. My colleagues from the Initiative for Global Resilience, ADPC, and JICA have provided a substantial background and plenty of food for thought for the Q&A period to follow this presentation, and hopefully we were hoping to have a presentation from UNDRR as well. So I would like to encourage you to add questions to the Q&A box, and we'll try to address those questions as we go along. And I'm hoping that going through the slides that I have, and I do plan to go through them quickly to give you some more time to ask questions at the end. So please do add questions to the Q&A, and if we can't get to them during this time, we'll try to answer them afterwards. The slides will be posted on the website as a PDF. In keeping with today's theme, I will present on USAID's approach to partnerships for disaster risk reduction in Asia. Before going into some brief details on the relatively new Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, I would like to reiterate the US government's admiration and support for the Sendai Framework for Action and its contribution to global disaster risk reduction efforts. My colleagues here from JICA and ADPC have all provided tremendous leadership and support to the efforts of developing countries to improve their risk reduction efforts in the face of increasing risks. The first slide shows some of the support provided by USAID for what is, I hope, the worst disaster of my lifetime, as we are currently in the middle of the global COVID-19 pandemic, and it has truly impacted us all. It's important to remember that the Sendai Framework, and I was fortunate to have been able to attend the proceedings in Sendai, specifically address the need for improved pandemic preparedness. The pandemic has certainly shown some holes and in how well we've been able to prepare or work together as a international community. But in some ways, I think there's just a lot to be learned from that and a lot that we need to do better. Next slide, please. Now, let me quickly let you know what USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance is and how we view our partnerships in Asia. We were officially created in 2020, merging USAID's Offices of Food for Peace and US Foreign Disaster Assistance. And While we are the only USAID bureau that provides humanitarian aid and sets foundations for longer-term recovery, we are not the only USAID bureau supporting disaster risk reduction. USAID has broadly mainstreamed disaster risk reduction into all of our programming, making it part of our mandatory environmental considerations so that all USAID programs address any potential negative impacts to the environment, as well as any potential impacts from the environment, always seeking to decrease disaster risk. Next slide, please. BHA's mandate is very simple, to save lives, alleviate human suffering, and reduce the impacts of humanitarian crises. Next slide. To deliver on our mandate, we provide life-saving support in response to disasters, provide early recovery support to help restore livelihoods, support standalone risk reduction programming, and provide what we term resilience programming to areas in recurring crises that combines humanitarian and development assistance to build community resilience. Now, all of these areas include elements of disaster risk reduction as part of our mainstreaming efforts. Next slide, please. Responding to disasters takes up the bulk of our resources as a Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. In 2020, for example, we responded to 66 separate disasters in 49 countries at a total of $7 billion. Next slide. Early recovery builds on humanitarian responses, supporting restoration of livelihoods and basic systems and services. Reducing future disaster risk is always a strong consideration in our early recovery efforts. Next slide, please. And I do apologize for going through the slides quickly, but again, I'd like to have time for your questions and answers. And again, it will be posted. You'll be able to take a look at the slides. There are some wonderful pictures in there. Standalone disaster risk reduction program has always been very important to our work in Asia, where we recognize the high vulnerability to both hydrometeorological hazards and geophysical hazards. For well over 20 years, USAID has supported community-based disaster preparedness, management, and risk reduction. The terminology has changed over time, but more importantly, the capacities of communities and governments from local to national to decrease their disaster risk. Has greatly improved. One example of a USAID program to support disaster response preparedness in Asia has been the Program for Excellence in Emergency Response, or PEER, with involvement from many countries across the Asia region in its 20+ years of implementation. ADPC initiated the program for us, and it has since evolved with the engagement of the National Society for Earthquake Technology in Nepal. The program started with North-South cooperation, bringing expertise from urban search and rescue teams in the US to train trainers and develop curricula, and quickly morphed into a South-South cooperation program with master trainers from across Asia, helping to train their Asian neighbors. Oh, and don't let me forget, the American Red Cross was also part of the effort, and always looking for partners. USAID always seeks to leverage existing capacities, and Asia is rich with capacity, even though vulnerabilities abound. This slide mentions sustainable development and nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation is an area that BHA is very much supporting in pursuit of environmentally beneficial and sustainable risk reduction solutions. Next slide, please. Resilience programming is very much focused on livelihoods and food security and reducing risk for chronically vulnerable populations. The programs seek to increase adaptive capacities to better weather and recover from shocks and stresses. DRR is clearly very important in this type of programming. While most of the resilience programming is focused on more vulnerable populations in Africa, vulnerable populations in Bangladesh and Nepal have also been recipients of what is now called resilience programming. Early in my career with USAID, I was able to spend time in Bangladesh supporting the two legacy Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance offices, the OFDA and FFP. My 2 years in Bangladesh with frequent travel across the region shaped my appreciation for the extreme combination of capacities and vulnerabilities that course through Asia. Next slide, please. Now, saving the best for last and getting back to the partnership theme, as partnerships is how we support DRR. Here's a picture of Ben Hemingway, leading response in the Philippines. Ben represents the cornerstone of our partnerships approach, and that is field-based programming. Ben worked for many years as a regional advisor for East Asia and the Pacific, and is now leading our South and Central Asia team. Regional advisors from these teams are the first point of contact for establishing partnerships for DRR in Asia. We respect and partner with affected communities, local and national governments, international partners, other US government entities, international donors, and the private sector. In closing, I would like to mention one important area of current focus of the US government, including USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and that is the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are always looking to diversify our partnership base and be more inclusive of partners that have not been adequately represented in the humanitarian and DRR communities. While we seek to achieve a more equitable distribution of resources, this can be difficult due to the non-equitable distribution of capacities and vulnerabilities. We know we need to do more and welcome your suggestions for how to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive in our partnerships moving forward. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that very, very interesting presentation. I like what you said about Asia, rich in capacity, but also rich in vulnerability. it's so true. It's like we're the super highway of disasters around here. And yeah, and congratulations on the peer program, which is now 20 years. That has been quite an achievement for you guys. And now, finally, to our fourth speakers, may I introduce Mr. Timothy Wilcox, who is the Program Management Officer, Asian Pacific at the United Nations Office on Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNDRR. Mr. Wilcox is currently the manager of UNDRR activities in Southeast Asia, as well as the former head of office of UNDRR's sub-regional office in the Pacific, based in Suva, Fiji. Nice, for 5 years. Prior to this, he served in the Australian aid program for many years, managing Australian disaster mitigation, response, and recovery efforts in the Pacific. He also managed humanitarian policy, disaster risk reduction, regional pandemics, and health programs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tim Wilcox.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And I'll just activate my presentation here. All right, so hopefully you can see that. So I understand we've already spoken about the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. Tomorrow is, as we've heard, the 13th of October, which is International Disaster Risk Reduction Day. And the framework essentially tries to bring together the world to reduce risk from disasters. Many people often think, that we cannot prevent disasters. That's not true. We actually can. Most of these things that we think of disasters are actually hazards, things like cyclones, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, etc. Those are all hazards. What makes it a disaster is if the community is overwhelmed and we're not able to absorb the shocks of those hazards. So the great thing about the Sendai Framework was it essentially tried to shift the thinking from disaster management, that is trying to manage the disaster itself, to managing the risk of the disaster happening in the first place. So taking this more of a preventative approach, and of course being more people-centered. So being inclusive of women, elderly people, persons with a disability, and making sure that they are involved at all levels of disaster risk reduction, from the planning side to the implementation to the monitoring and evaluation. So a real partnership. But more than that, it included more partners than before, which gave them a bigger role, like private sector. Whereas before the private sector was mentioned, now there's like a greater emphasis on making sure the private sector and all the other partners are included in that, because really the only way we're actually going to reduce the risk of disasters is together as a whole. And that's really what it tries to do. Essentially, there are 7 goals, and this year we're celebrating the letter F there, so the sixth one, which is substantially enhance international cooperation to developing communities. And really, international cooperation, can have such a powerful influence on reducing disaster losses in countries struggling to eradicate poverty. I mean, essentially, it can bring vital support to low-income countries struggling to implement their national strategies for disaster risk reduction. And there are many good examples of development assistance helping to reduce loss of life by supporting multi-hazard early warning systems, restoring protective ecosystems, building flood defenses, and even cyclone shelters, just to mention a few. And UN member states, I think, were right to include international cooperation to developing countries as one of the 7 targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015 when it was adopted. And part of the framework attempts to track how much we actually are giving to developing countries in this international cooperation. So for the first time, we're now actually measuring the financial and the technical support given to developing countries under the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So how do we actually do this? I mean, and first of all, when we talk about international cooperation, a lot of times people think we're just talking about money, when in fact we're actually talking about more than that. It's about partnerships, it's about cooperation. It could be capacity building within a country. It could be, one country sending someone out to another country, to a developing country, to do training, or the sharing of technology and resources. So it's much more than just money. And a good example of how we can actually bring some of these partners into what we're doing with disaster risk reduction in country is with the private sector. And a good example is the ARISE network. So that we started a few years ago. ARISE essentially stands for Private Sector Alliance for Disaster Resilient Societies. So unfortunately, the acronym doesn't match up with the name too well, but it officially started by us in 2015 to support the private sector to become a key partner in reducing disaster risk. And there's 3 networks here in the region. Obviously, there's Japan is a highly developed country, and then India is a middle income country, and Philippines as well. But we have Japan, the Philippines, and India here in the region so far. We're looking to broaden that to other countries here in the region. So welcome suggestions if there's other countries out there that are interested in starting a network. At the moment, there's about 28 national networks around the world. There's about 400 plus member companies with about 850 members in the shared community across 49 countries. And I'd actually probably say there's more than that because the number needs to be revised. But essentially, the goal of ARISE is to bring business together with public sector and other stakeholders to encourage partnerships and knowledge sharing, and to help essentially deliver on the objectives of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we've got these 4 focus areas here. One, of course, is enhancing the resilience of small and medium enterprises. We see a lot of our ARISE networks do that. That's mainly through training of micro and small medium enterprises on business continuity planning, the creation of tools, etc., and sharing knowledge on how to experiences on how to do BCP, integrating disaster and climate risk into investment decisions by the financial sector. So there's a lot of strong work being done, particularly in ARISE Philippines, and working with the banking industry and the insurance industry, and incentivizing disaster risk reduction and enhanced data for risk-informed decision-making. So do people actually get access to all this disaster and risk data? I mean, and if so, do they actually understand it? So it's helping, private sector understand where this data is and how to get it and how to understand it and use it in their business operations. And of course, supporting resilient infrastructure development. A lot of infrastructure being done is actually done by the private sector, whether it's building a bridge or constructing a new school or something like that, or a power company, a power station, or water plant. And of course, they should be incorporating resiliency into these infrastructure projects. So I'm just going to briefly talk about a quick case study in ARISE Philippines. It was formed in 2015 and organized through the strong leadership of SM Prime Holdings in country, who amongst any other things own many of the shopping malls over there, and they've all made them resilient to hazards such as flooding. And at the moment, they've got about 150 national member companies, but they're very strong with their work plan and working with micro and small medium enterprises in the Philippines, who actually make up almost about, I think, 98% of all the businesses in the country. But more importantly, they're recognized by the government as a key partner. And that's very important, because the government has actually given them a seat on the National Resilience Council that they sit on, and they always support the Arise Network activities. But more importantly, when the government's doing an activity, it asks the Arise Network members to join them in their work. And I think that partnership is really essential to their success in the Philippines. So it's fantastic. Just quickly talking about them again, some of the examples of their public-private partnerships that they've been doing. Again, as I've mentioned, there was a creation of the National Resilience Council, which is co-chaired by the government and private sector. That's very important because it's actually seen as an equal chairing. They've institutionalized the delivery of goods and products as well as services as part of pre-agreement following a disaster, which is really important. You don't want to have to do these things after the disaster or during the disaster, but you actually formalize these agreements beforehand. A capacity building for stakeholders in partnership with the various national government agencies. So they actually are included in a lot of government training workshops, and they also contribute to training workshops of government agencies. And partnering to create, for example, a facility for parametric catastrophic peril. So they're working with the micro insurances to cover Philippine micro and small medium enterprises there, as well as technical assistance working with local government units on the use of validation of the National Resilience Council system scorecard. So this is actually really interesting, where they work with local government to measure the local government resilience to hazards and disasters, and actually work with them to help develop plans to build the resilience of the local government in that area. So that's a really good example of the partnership working. And there's not necessarily money involved in these things. I mean, a lot of these things are sharing expertise, sharing knowledge, sharing experience, giving opportunities, etc., and sharing space. So I think this is a good example of where the private sector can be involved. Another example I'll just quickly talk about before I finish is there's also the Making Resilience City campaign. Essentially, this campaign's been going on for a while, and it was relaunched as an initiative this year, now known as the MCR 2030. Essentially, what it tries to do is it tries to improve local government, like cities or towns, understanding of what their risk is, what are they being exposed to, and trying to secure the local government authority commitment to local disaster risk reduction and resilience. As well as trying to strengthen the capacity of the city or the town to develop local strategies and plans to enhance their resilience, right? So it's understanding what their risks are and then helping them develop a plan to manage those risks. And then, of course, to support them in implementing those plans and those strategies. So there's a picture of the website there, and the website's at the bottom there. And of course, one key thing in this that's a really good example of partnerships and helping each other is this, one of the cross-cutting objectives is to get the cities to help cities, right? So if there's a city that has been through this process where they've actually understand that risk and they've developed a DRR strategy, that maybe they can actually partner with a sister city. Most cities or towns have a sister city. They actually partner with them. It doesn't have to be with them. It could be with another city somewhere else in the country or in another country nearby. So it's really kind of looking at this South-South collaboration in many ways and really taking advantage of those experiences and knowledges so it's not lost. And of course, re-emphasizing the partnerships. The MCR 2030 has many global partners, as you can see here from the picture, and it really aims to be a platform that's co-owned and co-delivered by these core partners and agencies. So it's not just about UNDRR, it's about Habitat, World Bank, UCLG, JICA, IFRC, ITCLE, etc. So really kind of taking advantage of everyone's knowledge, working together to help build the resilience of towns and cities across the world, particularly in developing countries, so we can achieve our Sendai Framework. Lastly but not least, we're also, just if people are interested, Another good example of these partnerships and taking advantage of expertise is a new cruise project that's just been launched in Laos and Cambodia. It's on climate risk early warning systems. The three partners for that is the World Meteorological Organization, ourselves and World Bank. And of course, we partner with all these national partners in country, Cambodia and Laos, in the hydrology and meteorology sector, as well as the National Disaster Management Office. So as you can see, there's lots of partners, and we try to, we will be working with our partners, there's many more, NGOs, CSOs, the Red Cross societies, other UN agencies, etc., that we'll be working together on these early warning system projects. So as you can see, there's money involved with this one. The budget is $5.5 million over 4 years, and it really aims to enhance the capacity of national and regional stakeholders and institutions, really to make sure that early warning system messages get to the people who need them the most, but more importantly, that they understand what those early warning messages are and they know what to do. So it's really kind of linking up with that planning side of things with the local government again. So I just wanted to highlight those three examples there of how we can really kind of bring and create partnerships and cooperation between partners and organizations, resilience of our countries and our communities, in particular developing countries, as we move towards achieving the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, which strangely enough comes to an end in not so long from now, 9 years, just under 9 years, over 9 years time. And we're doing a midterm review in about a year's time. So, it was created in 2015, but time moves away from us. So really, I think these are some good examples. I'm sure you have many more, and happy to take some more questions. And those are my details there. So thanks very much, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Tim. Really interesting presentation on that. Thank you to all our speakers for this webinar. And now we have some questions coming in. May I ask the speakers to turn on their video, please? Thank you. First one for you, Michael. In which part of USAID's work program, response, early recovery, risk reduction, and resilience do you think USAID has made the best breakthrough with it in developing country partners, and why?
It's an interesting question. Again, our risk reduction efforts really are spread across the 4 areas. But I would have to sort of admit that our greatest success, and again, since we are a humanitarian agency that works very much with the response side as well as risk reduction, that some of our best efforts and successes in Asia have been improving response preparedness. And I think in a way, if you look at the legacy, the reason we have the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, why it's called that, is that was a lot of our early thinking, and I think we invested a lot in that, and ADPC has a lot really to be proud of in terms of how it's helped other countries in the region. That's where I've seen just tremendous strides in the capacities of responders across the region. The numbers of lives saved is profound, and I think that for a mandate of saving lives and for any humanitarian, that's a very primary thing. Now, it's also important to note that disaster risk reduction saves lives. That's obviously its intent, and some of the work we've done and supported in places like Bangladesh for flood proofing, saving lives and livelihoods. It's really been tremendous support for the cyclone preparedness program. There's no question that it's the best way to save lives. A response can't compare. We tend not to support large structural interventions, but more small non-structural ones. But again, there's just tremendous successes, and we've seen the growth in the success and power of our partners, especially local partners, and that's been the most gratifying across all those areas. Thank you.
Sorry, I mute myself. Great to hear that, Michael. Dr. Nagami, I know you answered this question, but perhaps our other participants would like to see it if they didn't see it. your response. So continuing on the final part of your presentation, how much do you think technology will play in meeting the challenge of more frequent and intense climate-induced disasters?
Thank you, Barbara, and the person who threw the question to me. Science and technology is the key to manage.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you speak louder, please? We can't hear you.
Can you hear? Okay. Science and technology is, of course, the key to manage the very uncertain climate risk. First, we have to better understand the future risk with urbanization and climate change, and technology should play the key role for this. Second, again, with the technology, we have to revolutionize the DRR solutions to reduce the increase in disaster risk. We have to combine, for example, urban development with DRR measures, for example. Total optimization of DRR as a whole society should be attained with technology. That's my idea. Thank you.
Yeah, that's so true. It's all parts of the society need to work on this and not just a few parts. Thank you for that. There's a question here on, I guess I will have to ask for everyone. As this year is IDDRR focused on international cooperation, I wonder how international partnerships and cooperation take into account the emerging risk of man-made disasters, not only in Asia, but also in Pacific countries. Looking forward to your insightful thoughts and ideas about this. This is from June Rose. Thank you, June, for your question. Let's start with you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. No, and thanks, June. Yeah, to be honest, I mean, I'm a disaster manager by background, and essentially, you really need to take into account all hazards, and really that's the hallmark of anything. That you should be looking not just as natural hazards, but also man-made hazards, as well as technological, even if it's extraterrestrial. Believe me, there's actually a category of extraterrestrial, and I'm not talking about alien invaders. Here, little green men. It's actually like solar flares, asteroids, meteorites, etc. I mean, there's lots of stuff that affects us. Solar flares are constantly affecting satellites, which then affects the community that they serve. And really, disaster managers have to take this all hazards approach, even if it's slow onset. So like with climate change, whereas it's sea level rising, etc. And as you say, man-made disasters, and hazards are getting more and more. As population gets bigger, cities get more crowded. We're seeing more and more of these, particularly with more industry, more commercial, factories, etc. That people live closer to these things, and that they're affected. So if something happens in the factory, it happens to the residents that live nearby. So, and I think COVID-19 in many ways has kind of highlighted a lot of these weaknesses in our communities that we may not have necessarily been as aware of before. And it's kind of highlighted where we need to improve the weaknesses in a lot of our planning. So we really have to incorporate, when we do these plans, all these factors, particularly all these hazards, and really well. So that's just my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Tim. How about you, Aslam? What would you answer to this question?
Thank you. I think first I would respond to June Rose by asking that which disasters are not man-made, because of the late we have started accepting that all the disasters are man-made to a large extent. So, I mean, because as a professional, I always see what is natural, what is unnatural. And, but I know that from where she is coming. I think my direct answer is that the international partnership and cooperation, and particularly for small island countries, and of course the direct reference here is for the Pacific countries, I would say that we have to focus on equity-based investment rather than equality-based investment, because these countries need much, much more investment than their size and their reach to say how much they need. So I think that is what I would say, because the risk in Pacific countries, small island countries, are much, much immense, both from hydrometeorological hazard plus from the climate extreme side. So I would emphasize that it should be an equity-based investment in disaster risk reduction rather than an equal distribution of subs. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Aslam. How about you, Michael? What would your take on this be?
Okay. Anyway, well, it's an interesting one. I guess my take on that, and when we don't specifically do DRR related to technological hazards, we work on we support natural hazard DRR risk, but then when we support response preparedness, of course, it covers all of them. One thing I would say that technological hazards specifically, since it's mostly related to human engineering, that's where the improvements need to take place. So I think often we in the DRR community forget that, in fact, that the original design, the basic construction of the infrastructure, that's where most of the risk reduction takes place. If it's done correctly, then we don't need to worry about separate risk reduction measures because it's been incorporated into the design, it's been mainstreamed into the effort. And I think that's particularly true with technological risk. And there needs to be care, there needs to be all sorts of issues raised about making sure that the capacities are there to deal with and address that risk, and that it's considered all the different things that take place as well. And while certainly a lot of risk due to disasters is certainly a human construct. It's certainly with natural hazards, there is a hazard that has to be lived with, and there's always a certain amount of risk that we can't eliminate, although so much work that we can do, and that's the most important thing. One thing that we do need to think about in general is that disaster mortality has actually decreased over the past 100 years. And I think that's something that we have to, it works. So DRR really does work and saves lives. And that means building better infrastructure, being more aware of the risk. We can do that, it works. We certainly have to do more. And I would never speak against that because of course it's risk that we can reduce, it's lives that we can save. So we need to do it. But again, we need to look back, step back and say, hey, it does work. We can build safer cities. We can build a safer environment for people to live in. And the evidence suggests that.
Thank you for reminding us about that mortality is actually decreasing. And yes, the work that we do in DRR is actually working. Lastly to you, Dr. Nagami, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, my response would be very much similar to the former three responders, that human behavior always affect the three elements of disaster risk. That is hazard, exposure, and vulnerability of our human society. And maybe June was somehow focusing on the human triggered hazard type of disaster, but not only with that, our human society's vulnerability is also increasing with human behavior and the human development activities. So the key point would be how we can regulate and how we can control our own behaviors and actions, or for more risk-oriented, risk-informed, the orientation, and so that in order for them to do that, we, DRR people, should provide risk information. What kind of human action would increase the disaster risk? That is very important intervention from our DRR arena. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Dr. Nagami. That was insightful. We have a comment here. It was more from Hasne Begum, which he put on the chat, but it was passed to the Q&A. And it states that, disaster response can't be gender blind. The issue of vulnerability and resilience are very different for women and other marginalized intersections across countries. Unless very careful and focused gender lens on the overall responses, it will remain a huge gap in achieving DRM goals. Perhaps let's get your take on this because gender is also really a big issue on DRM efforts. Tim, first one.
Yeah, that's all right. No, I fully agree with the statement. I mean, we know that disasters affect different parts of the population differently. We know that women are often affected adversely in different, more than men are in different ways. But we also know that persons with a disability, are often impacted even more in different, because like they may not have access to resources, they may not be able to get resources. I mean, disaster response, needs to incorporate, all these different features of making sure that it reaches those that need them. I mean, for example, if a government decides to hand out food rations to people who to a community that doesn't have any food, but it doesn't take into account the cultural differences of maybe the women are not allowed to leave the house, or maybe persons with a disability, are not able to get to the food station. All these different factors need to come into play. And so fully agree that, disaster risk reduction, as well as disaster response, all needs to take into account a gender lens. Is also looking at the different needs of the vulnerable, the different needs of the different population groups within the community, but also how to actually use those different parts of the population groups in the planning of disaster management, in the planning of disaster risk reduction at the very beginning. Because in many ways, women are not a vulnerable group, they are an actual agents for change, and they can actually, contribute, just as much to a disaster response or to disaster risk reduction as men can, as well as youth, as well as persons with a disability. So it's about really kind of, making sure that we take full advantage of all these different population groups and what they bring to what we're trying to do and trying to build a resilient community. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Aslam, any thoughts on this and how we can achieve the gap, how we could bridge this gap?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you, Husne, for raising this. I know that we both work on this subject, and I personally am the one who always celebrate the strength of womanhood if we talk about gender from this particular perspective. I think my focus and my suggestion will be that when we create enabling environment for public-private financing or investment, we must ensure the utility of gender equal, right-based, or localized approaches, both at the local program, national and regional program for social protection, collaboration, and synergies. What is important, as Tim already mentioned, that women are agent of change, and this has to be in practice rather than in rhetoric. So my suggestion will be that women are equal in risk sharing and risk reduction partners. So when we talk about on gender based things, I think we must also understand that it is not a weaker section. We must highlight the equity within our programs that we fund or that we implement. Thank you.
Michael, do you have any take on this? If you have USAID work on gender?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I would just reiterate what everyone is saying. It's very much a part of our guidelines. We simply don't support activities that don't take the special considerations of gender, of any vulnerable people. I mean, the most important aspect of humanitarian assistance or disaster risk reduction from our point of view is to reach the most vulnerable. So obviously there have to be gender considerations, there have to be considerations of differential ages, differential, whether disabilities of any kind. All of this has to be considered. Our minority groups, especially vulnerable in some way, the whole issues of LGBTQ, all of these issues are part of what we're looking at. And we are seriously looking at it even more closely now as we talk about these important issues I've mentioned before of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's just a very important aspect of what we do, and we're always seeking more partners that do a better job. But it's essential, and we know we need to do a better job, and we take it quite seriously.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Nagami, what's your take on this?
Thank you so much. This, gender blind issue should be taken care not only for the disaster response, but also for the pre-disaster DRR investment and everything. We have to be sure to secure the gender and poverty and this disability and elder peoples and young people, children. Everything should be taken into account in the every cycle of the disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management. And one thing we should be very sure is before the disaster occurs, we have to identify who is such kind of disadvantaged people, not only for the gender aspect, but also everything. And we have to disaggregate those people, and we have to identify those people. And when the disaster occurs or before the disaster occurs, we have to consider how we can work together with those people, not only protect them. Yeah, disaggregation is the key to do this kind of taking care. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think 𝗏𝗏 has a direct question for you, Tim. How is MCR 2030 doing in Asia? How many cities are registered? Are you building on work done on the past decade?
Yeah, I don't have the latest figures of the countries that have signed up on the new initiative, but we are asking countries that have previously signed up to sign up to this new initiative, and we will be reaching out to many cities that have done before work and building upon that. They don't have to repeat their work, but we ask them to revise. But yeah, no, we'll be building upon the work done in the past. There's some good examples of some cities that have signed up. In fact, they were actually listed as role model cities about 10 years ago or so under the original campaign. And since then, politicians change, mayors change, local government officials change. And so, the new campaign, the new initiative, MCR 2030, will be looking to reach out to them again and see if they can, continue the work or build upon the work that they've already done or to reinitiate the work. So yeah, it will be building upon the previous work. We're also working on a dashboard on the website. So soon we'll hopefully be having some numbers of the number of cities that have signed up. But it was officially launched earlier this year. So yeah, very excited about it. And hopefully with our partners, we can get more towns and cities signed up. Thanks.
Great. And still from 𝗏𝗏 to you, Aslam, give us some current and future activities of ADPC is doing in building resilience and preparedness in both disaster and climate risks.
Thank you. I was a bit shy today highlighting ADPC, but thanks to Michael already spoke. If I just have to say from an investment perspective, because it's very, we generally deliver for $15 to $20 million activities in a year. But let me just put this way. I mean, since Michael already recalled the help or the investment by USAID on ADPC since 1986, if I have to just tell you, it is over now about $50 million with us. Now, for example, preparing emergency responder is another thing. But if I just say that the current program, we call it Survey Mekong, it is a great example that, you are not only looking at emergency at a time, but you are actually bringing expertise. And we are working with NASA and how we can bring some villages. Now, this is one, but a number of programs, for example, we are looking at extreme climate events. We have just signed, after almost about 15 years of our direct work with Tim, a statement of cooperation from where we are looking at science, policy, and practice perspective, in addition to our support for the Sendai Framework. A number of our programs are directly targeted towards enhancing capacities of the government. So, whether it is our Surveyor program or our Asia Preparedness Partnership, whether it is our Norway programs, all those are targeting towards enhancing the capacities of the government. With JICA, we are quite being a beneficiary from their technology side, rather than, if I would say, I don't really recall that, we really access funding from them. But the kind of technological advancement that they bring through their SATREP, through their other programs, where a smaller tool that is being developed, we do it. And of course, together with Tim, we promote low-cost, high-impact program, whether it is about promoting Sendai Framework in more than 40 countries by a 5-minute video, or 31 countries DRR status report that we prepare, follow up, revise, update, and talk all the time. So a number of programs, but not really important. My main emphasis has been that all the investment in ADPC, of course, certainly has carried a value. We heard about it, but much more has to be done. And it has to be done more primarily looking at the targets that we have at hand, both SDG, Paris Agreement commitments, as well as the Sendai Framework. So, ADPC is one of the important partner, important vehicle for sure. Thank you.
Thank you for that. There's still some more questions, but unfortunately, we don't have time anymore. We will endeavor to ask all our speakers if they could give some answers, and hopefully we could post this all in the website in the future. But right now, I'd like to ask some closing remarks from all our speakers. Can I start with you, Dr. Nagami, please?
Thank you so much, everybody, participating in today's very fruitful and interesting discussions, particularly the other speakers. Thank you, Barbara, and everybody. And I had a very much, enjoyed this kind of, very interactive discussion. Thanks to all. Thank you so much.
Aslam, parting words?
Okay, I think we did discuss a broad spectrum of instrument, facilities, and modalities for disaster, investing in disaster risk reduction. I think the way forward is to enhance those enabling environment, promote more financial resilience in vulnerable countries, and some of who are vulnerable groups within the society. That would be my update.
Michael, last words?
Okay, and I'll also try to address a little bit of the pandemic question, but I'll definitely type more in the chat. But and I would build on ADPC mentioned the pandemic, and there's no question it has a huge impact on the globe, and it's shown tremendous weaknesses, especially when we talk about equitable assistance. I mean, the vulnerabilities have been highly differential. The wealthy tending to do quite well, the poor heavily impacted. And I think that context and realizing that the one sort of strong lesson, though, is that the only way that we're all safe, the only way that the world is safe is if we're all safe. So that we have to come together on this. And I'm sort of hoping that we can continue to learn that lesson, that we have to help each other. We have to make this COVID situation work. And it's the same for all of the DRR work that we do. Every country has to be safe, or none of us are safe. And a lot of the problems that we're facing today are these inequity issues, and supporting disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation is another great example. We're one spaceship Earth floating through space. We have to deal and solve these problems, but we have to do it together. And in the partnership approach is the only way we're going to do it. We're trying to increase resource spending on DRR and climate change adaptation. We know it's very important, and it's very important for the rest of the world, but there are a lot of challenges. And so we all really need to work together. And this is a real plea as well to the private sector to get out there and really engage with us. And it's going to be good for you as well as for the rest of the planet. Again, thank you very much for allowing me to speak on this panel. It's been a great pleasure to share this time with you.
So last but definitely not least, Tim?
Yeah, I think if you look at the amount of investment done in disaster risk reduction over the years, it's definitely increasing. But compared to disaster response, it's still very small. The great bulk of cash that goes towards disasters is definitely response. We could sit here all day and talk about why that is. Disaster response is sexier, if I can use that word. A picture of someone going in, rescuing someone is far more exciting than a picture of me at my desk working on a plan on disaster risk reduction. But, at the end of the day, it's really the prevention and the mitigation of these things saves probably more lives. As we've already heard, the number of deaths over the years is decreasing. But of course, the amount of damage being done to the infrastructure is probably increasing to the built environment. But I really kind of feel that we need to really make sure that we invest more in DRR, even if it's not as exciting. Because at the end of the day, it's really about saving lives but also protecting livelihoods. We may have less deaths, but people's lives are severely affected by these things. COVID-19 is a great example where the businesses have shut down, people's livelihoods have been affected, and they rely on support from the government to survive. So there's a whole raft of areas that need to be looked into. But I think at the end of the day, maximizing the resources that we have, looking to increase investment and taking advantage of these partnerships and cooperation, I think is really essential. Thanks.
Oh, thank you for that. And thank you for reminding us that while our jobs are boring, we have good impact. And yes, at the end of the day, we are working so that humanitarian response is minimized. And that's really where DRR work comes into play. Thank you very much.
They look boring, Barbara. They're not boring. They look boring. Yeah.
Okay. Nice catch. Thank you so much to all our speakers. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you also to all our participants who are with us for the whole webinar. It is a really great pleasure to have been discussing this all with you. And like I said, your questions will be answered. All those questions that are answered, we will post the answers for that. We'll send it to the speakers, to our panelists, and then so that they could give their answers to you. And please also make sure that we have a survey after this. So please answer it, because it will really help us service for the next webinars. With that, Monica will have last words on the REDCON 2022. And with that, thank you very much, and stay safe.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your time and for participating in the webinar today. We hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from the exchange. So once again, we look forward to seeing you at REDCON Asia, Resilience on Emergency and Disaster Conference Asia, that will take place on 7th to 9th of December 2022 at the United Nations Conference Center in Bangkok. Yes, and it will be co-located with SDG Unite 2022. That will be bannered on the theme Accelerating Business Leadership on SDGs Promoting Net Zero and Circular Economy. So stay tuned. You can check our website at redcon-asia.com for more updates, and we look forward to having you in the upcoming webinars in the coming months. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you and goodbye.